Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk about the article Voices from the Movement. Before I begin getting into some of the details that Nakashima is trying to get us to understand, I want to give us kind of place this in a certain context. Today, we seem to be more accepted biracial or multiracial individuals, but this is a relatively recent development. In fact, it can really be seen as a post-Second World War development. Prior to the 1940s, the idea of being mixed race was seen in some eyes as being impure, some eyes as seen as an atrocity to the race. And it's important to understand that this hasn't just, in our society, the U.S. history, has not just been about the mixing of races, but the mixing of religions. It's also been a very important aspect, an important part of society where Catholics shouldn't marry Jews or Protestants shouldn't marry Baptists. That we've had this religious divide, this kind of sense of keeping some type of religious purity involved. So we see that up until the Second World War, this kind of idea, getting back to issues of race mix or the mixing of races, that it wasn't widely accepted. That you were seen as mongrels, that you were seen as impure, that this race mixing was such a threat that there were actually anti-miscegenation laws. There were laws put into this country that lasted up until the 1950s and 1960s that prevented whites from marrying non-whites. So we have this kind of structure that it not only became legally institutionalized to deny mixed race relationships, to deny marriages between different races. We see it happening within the film and within the idea of Hollywood, that there were these film codes that were placed into effect that, again, you couldn't see any type of romantic relationship between whites and non-whites. In fact, we see, like in the 1960s with Star Trek, that in one episode of Star Trek, that would be the mid to late 60s, that was the first time in television's history that a black woman kissed a white man. So this idea, or this kind of acceptance that we may have over people of mixed race is relatively recent. And we also know that the acceptance, no matter how limited it is leading to where people who are of mixed race, the offspring of biracial or mixed race relationships, are the fastest growing percentage-wise, or the fastest growing population in our country. So we see in this type of thing that we are moving towards a greater understanding and a greater appreciation for people who are mixed race. But this understanding and appreciation isn't occurring without struggle. And this is what Nakashima is trying to get us to understand. It's the struggle that many people who are mixed race go through, myself, as a white father and a Mexican mother, who was raised to believe he was white, but was always treated, as a friend called me, the kid from Taco Time. Even in my own family, I saw the idea of race and the idea of racial superiority. I wrote a poem a long time ago, Family Dinner at 6, where I talk about when I was younger, how my siblings, especially my brother and my sister, who were just a year or two younger than me, because I was the oldest, and therefore the strongest, they couldn't beat me up when they were mad at me. So they found other ways to attack me, and one of the ways they found to attack me is when they were mad, they would call me nigger. And so it seems like at a very early age, I understood the issue of the difference between me looking like my grandfather and taking after the Garcias, and my brother and sister who looked like our father and taking after the Adams, very light skin, very light hair, and I really am almost a mirror image. I could be my grandfather's twin. So I see this confusion. So Nakashima gets us to understand that in this kind of movement, this mixed race movement, which he defines as a combination of various publications, groups, and academics involved, and providing a voice for those who are interracial, that in this movement there are three central themes among this movement. One, locating a racial ethnic identity depending on context and time. This type of thing is something I was also involved in. I somehow knew that being part Mexican and part white had its advantages and disadvantages. So this kind of locating a racial ethnic identity depending on the context and time was something I used to do quite a bit when I was younger. If I knew a company was hiring and had affirmative action policies, I was Mexican. If I was going to private industry where I feared that I would be discriminated based on being a Mexican, I was white. So I was constantly switching from one racial ethnic identity to another based on the context and time. I also can take a look at this idea of racial ethnic identity in my development since I started college in Bellingham, Washington. It was interesting because there was a group of people that know me only as Chuck, a group of people that know me as Chuck who was becoming Carlos, and a group of people who only know me as Carlos. So I have these three sets of people during the 20 some odd years that I was in Bellingham and then going to school in Bellingham. And so I remember going out with one group and meeting friends from another group they were kind of like, well, who's this guy Chuck you're talking about? And who's this guy Carlos you're talking about? So in a sense, you see that I was carrying two racial ethnic identities at the same time. With one group I was Chuck, therefore white. And another group I was Carlos, therefore Chicano. So it is this idea, one of the themes is how we then maneuver and negotiate these racial ethnic identities. The next theme is the pressure to choose a monoracial identity by external forces. The pressure applied onto mixed race individuals to choose one or the other. Are you white or are you black? You have to make a choice. This idea, this pressure to choose, has been very difficult for people who are bi or multiracial because we don't feel as though we are one or the other. We are, in a sense, both. We understand that to some extent. Even on an unconscious level, if we don't understand it on an unconscious level. So it's the idea to choose, that I had to choose to be Chicano. I chose to be Chicano not because people were pressuring me to be a Chicano, but because I came to understand that as somebody who was brought up to believe he was white, Chuck, but always treated as though he was Carlos, I wanted to come to terms, wanted to come to grips with that identity of Carlos. And in that process, determined for myself that identifying as a Chicano was, for me, the only real choice I had left. And then the third theme is the questions and issues of group belonging. Even if you choose a certain racial ethnic identity over another, you're often met with questions from the group that you choose or questions from the group that you didn't choose. Excuse me. Again, I'll go back to my life. I've had Chicanos and Chicanas tell me I'll never be accepted as Chicano or Chicana because I'm not brown enough. I don't speak the language fluently enough. I don't speak it with a Spanish accent. I speak it with an Anglo accent. All these things put in doubts, questions into my legitimacy as a Chicano. On the other hand, my sister once asked me why I had to be Chicano. Why couldn't I just be an American? For her, being an American was being a white American. That's how she was treated. Even though she had a Mexican mother, she was treated as a white American, seen as a white American. So these questions and issues of group belonging become very important, often weigh heavily on a person. So these are some common elements getting into this. The next thing Nakashima moves into that I think is important is the three approaches in the movement. The first approach is struggle for inclusion and legitimacy in the traditional racial ethnic communities. This idea of having to prove ourselves, that we are guilty until proven innocent, rather than innocent until proven guilty. That I know that many people, when they choose a group, especially when they choose to be part of the subordinate group, the racial subordinate group, always struggled to be seen as legitimate in that process, or seen as legitimate by that group. We have set up, each group has kind of set up certain markers on how they try to identify, or how you gain legitimacy into that group. One, she talks about the badges we wear, clothes, hairstyles, speech, mannerisms, names, etc. These associations we have with people. Kind of hard for me to claim the identity as a Chicano if I just hang out with whites. That kind of questioning by the Chicano community would become more apparent. Prove their knowledge of and attachment to a culture, history, or political interests of the group they want to be included into. I often hear many of my students say, well, I'm part Indian. And I ask them, well, do you know anything about your Indian history? Well, no. Well, just because several generations ago an Indian fell into the family tree, you're playing in this kind of biological lineage. The idea of race and ethnicity is about knowing your history. It's about being involved in the political interests of that particular group. These are one of the ways that you're seen as legitimate by the monoracial group. Some examples that she gives: Asians as appearance and surname, Latinos as language. And I find if you don't speak Spanish from a Latino perspective, and I talked about it with Oquendo's article about the problems that I think are associated with using Spanish as a way of gaining legitimacy or being able to identify as a Latino. Blacks, person's lifestyle and cultural behavior, which would be very similar to whites. So each group, she is saying, its criteria is based on specific historical, cultural, and political context. So you have to be able to understand and relate to those things. And I'll talk more about that with interracial marriages on the next article. The second approach that she talks about is shaping of a shared identity and common agenda among racially mixed people into a new multiracial community. When I was at Western Washington University, I saw this. In the Ethnic Student Center, we had all these different groups, basically based on this monoracial identity. Since many mixed-race students were struggling to gain legitimacy into those monoracial groups, they created their own group, this multiracial, this multi-ethnic student organization. So the idea that they were able to use that biracial, multiracial identity or process of self-identification as a commonality, that we were all going through it, though in different ways, but that very common struggle of what Nakashima is talking about was the way that these students were able to form a community, to be able to bridge their differences and connect along lines of commonalities. The next thing, or the next approach that she talks about, is the struggle to dismantle racial ideology and group boundaries and to create connections across communities into a community of humanity. And what she's trying to get us to understand is that as biracial and multiracial individuals, we not only have a choice to try to gain legitimacy and acceptance in a monoracial group, and we not only have a choice but to create our own racial group that plays along the same kind of barriers and need for legitimacy as monoracial groups have. She says the choice that we have as biracial groups is to dismantle the racial boundaries that exist in the first place. To understand that if we attempt to gain legitimacy in the monoracial groups, we're playing into the hands of social constructions of race that have been seen to be problematic. If we choose our own group, we're doing the same thing. We have to, in creating that group, start to set the borders, start to set the limits on who can be seen as being included in that group. She says that this last part, the struggle to dismantle dominant racial ideologies and group boundaries in order to create connections across communities into a community of humanity, Well, it seems like the idea of moving towards a colorblind perspective, but it isn't. It is the recognition of differences, but a recognition of difference in such a way as to attempt to eliminate the boundaries or borders that define those differences. To move us into what she talks about, this fluid identity that she talks about on page 90, what Gloria wants to do is mestizo consciousness. The idea that Gloria expresses how she is part of all cultures, that these borders, these boundaries that we use to define racial identity are artificial constructions and serve no purpose but to maintain a separate view or a separate identity from another group that's doing the same type of process, that's creating their own boundaries, their own limitations on who can be included and who can be seen as legitimate. So she talks about this idea of what she calls the superracial. And her definition of the superracial is, the superracial are those individuals refusing to accept marginalization as a defining feature from either the dominant or ethnic racial communities, and involved in a naming process that legitimizes their existence as other within a center outside of self, other constructions in our racial ethnic binary. So it sounds very complicated, and I've talked about this idea of self and other and this idea of center and margins. But what she's trying to get us to understand is that the superracial is this attempt to not be included into the center of any monoracial group and not create its own center of a biracial group, therefore excluding then monoracial individuals, but to subvert that center and move everybody out to the margins, to where there is no center, there is no dominant belief, that we all understand that we are all fluid in our social constructions and our identities are constantly in the act of evolution. We are creatures that are always in the act of becoming. Who we are today is different than who we are going to be 20 years from now, and different than who I was 20 years ago, a lot different than who I was 20 years ago. So we see this kind of, this approach, and this is what Gloria is trying to get us to understand, is how we move to the margins, how we eliminate the center, dismantle these borders that keep us divided, while still recognizing the differences and valuing the differences as positive rather than as negative, as Memi expresses, and coming to terms with a fluid identity, a fluid understanding of who we are as social beings. In addition, the superracial see themselves as an other at the center in the middle of various racial ethnic categories. Not in the margins, that is, the other is a positive, not a negative aspect of their identity. So this incorporation of all that who we are as individuals, that we are not to sit there and discount one group in favor of another group. For example, in my case, when I see this happening, my legal name is Charles Anthony Adams. When I started to reclaim my Chicano-Mexican heritage, I wanted to change my name to Carlos Antonio Garcia. Here I was raised to deny the Carlos in me. And when I started to accept the Carlos in me, I did it in such a way that I wanted to deny the Charles in me or the Chuck in me. So now I go by Carlos Adams because that brings in both who I am as a Chicano and who I am as a white person. And this leads me to the important aspect that we talk about this process. Prior to coming to understand this in my own identity, what I saw is this idea of lacking, that my identity was lacking. I was never white enough to be accepted as, let me start over in that. I was too brown to ever be accepted by whites. And I was too white to ever be accepted by brown. So this idea of brownness and whiteness, we're never going to allow one or the other to the idea of acceptance. So in this idea that I was lacking enough whiteness to ever be considered white, and I was lacking enough brownness to ever be considered brown. But what I am, and what I've come to understand, and this is where it plays into this idea of the superracial, is that I am not lacking. I am what has been called by one writer a site of overdetermination. To what it is to be white and what it is to be brown comes together in me. I'm not lacking. I am where all these aspects of what it is to be white and what it is to be brown comes together within my subjectivity, within my identity, within my expressions of identity. So rather than being seen as lacking or being seen as impure or being seen as the mongrel as it used to be, I now like the idea that the superracial helps us present to this idea that we are a site of overdetermination. And what she's trying to get us to understand is in this site of overdetermination, in this subjectivity that is white and non-white, that we have to move to those fluid understandings. Therefore, that what we see the possibility of coming to terms with race in the future may not be by listening to monoracial groups, but in the future may come from people like myself, the bi and multiracial individuals who have to negotiate these multiple racial identities, gives us insight on how we can move beyond the boundaries and borders that define us and separate us in terms of race today. These are she goes on and says a few more things, but these are the real key concepts that I wanted to get across. I want to thank you.